part 2 of the pumpkin story. And she sat down on the couch with the pumpkin cake and her cup of tea or her cup of coffee, and I sat down in my chair with my coffee. I could have had a piece of pumpkin cake at home if I had wanted. And she proceeded to tell me a story about my Uncle Byers. He was a thin man, I guess a picturesque man, a dainty man, if you might say. He was very, very, very thin and just so. He worked for the railroad. What I had known of him was that he lived in the house in the field next to my grandfather, and he loved to walk. My grandfather had become crippled in his old age, but he still would go out into the fields and work on the turnip and the cabbage and the potato with my uncle and my father and the rest of us who would go out and work. I'd see my Uncle Byers going for a walk up across the field, cut through the brush and the bramble and head up to the head and up to the high head, and he'd wander around up there. No wonder he was so fit, especially walking through the bramble and the hedge. And later on I'd be out playing, and he'd come down through the bushes, and he'd stop and say hi. And we were always a little bit shy and taught not to approach adults, not so much out of fear back then, just out of politeness, because a child's place is to play and to be cared for, and when somebody wants to talk to you, then to be polite. And he'd walk over towards me, and we'd have a little chat, and he'd give me $1 or $2 for myself or my brother, or for both of us. And then he'd walk on his way back home. My mother was telling me that when she was little, he'd often offer to order things for her, because he had been a bachelor throughout my mother's perhaps most of her life. And he'd worked on the railroad, and he'd come home in the evenings after he had worked at the railway station and sleep in the room that later became my grandparents' room, the room that had been used for guests. When guests came, they would stay there. I believe it had been my grandfather's, his mother's room when she was still alive. And he'd often order her things or give her money also in the same way, because he was a bachelor and had a little bit of extra money. And she was talking about him as she ate the cake, and telling me that he had worked for the railway, and he had often traveled, I guess, on the rails, on the trains, because I guess you had the privilege to do that when you worked for the railway station. But Halloween was also his birthday.